Hi, my name is Taryn and welcome to the Grief and Grace series. Why is this series so important? Although not focusing specifically on the COVID-19 pandemic, it is clear that suffering, trauma and loss is heightened at this time. This series will feature a number of talks from Tim, CEO of the Message Trust South Africa, who himself lost his wife in 2016. Since then, he has written and spoken extensively on how he has navigated his own grief, facing the future he did not choose. In the first episode, Tim will share his own story. In future episodes, he will draw lessons from his experience that may help you navigate your own grief or enable you to help others who are experiencing grief. We will also include stories of other people who have had to navigate the difficult road of grief. Our main hope is that this series will help you encounter the grace of God in trying times. The author Paul Young wrote, "Grace doesn't depend on suffering to exist, but when there is suffering, you will find grace in many facets and colors." As we listen to Tim's story, our prayer is that you will experience the multifaceted nature of God's grace.
I remember quite clearly the day, well, maybe not the day things actually changed, but the day things began to change in my life in a way that was completely unexpected and unanticipated. I was actually walking home from work. I was working in Woodstock, coming back to my home here in Observatory in Cape Town, and walking down through Observatory where we lived with my family, my wife Laura and our 3 children. I came through the front door and I was surprised to find that nobody was home. As I walked through the door, the phone rang and I picked up the landline, and it was my son, Caleb, who was 12 years old at the time. And he said, she's not well, something's happened. And I was trying to find out where they were, and it turned out they were at a friend's house. The mum of the family, of their friends, came on the phone and said, "No, Laura's passed out, we're going to take her to the hospital, can you meet us at the hospital?" And it was one of those moments in life where you just don't quite know what's going to happen next. I didn't have my car, so I borrowed the neighbour's car, and by the time I got to the hospital, they were already there. And Laura was in the emergency room, and she was just coming round, and there was some confusion. The doctors weren't quite sure what had happened, and in the end they did admit her to hospital. She was in hospital for about 4 or 5 days. They ran a number of tests, but things were inconclusive. Something clearly maybe had happened with her brain. They found a couple of other things. They said they were going to plan a minor operation, and she came home, and we thought maybe life would begin to get back to normal. Her mum came down from Natal to help us out while Laura was recovering. I'm originally from the UK, my brother still lives in the UK. They were going to come over in August for a holiday, and we were excited for this holiday and thought that would be the tonic that Laura needed to fully recover from whatever it was. She had this minor operation actually on her sinuses. They thought that might clear up whatever had triggered this episode that she'd had. August the 9th, 2016 was our 16th wedding anniversary, and we went for breakfast. As a few days after Laura had this operation, we went for breakfast at the company gardens in Cape Town, celebrated our wedding anniversary as we normally would. And although Laura was tired, there was no great indication of what would follow. Laura herself, she was an incredible woman. We got married in 2000. She was an occupational therapist, and then served with me in ministry for a number of years. Her dream was to serve across Africa, and then children came, and eventually moved to Pretoria, lived there for a few years and enjoyed those years. And then in 2014 came back to Cape Town, moved here to Observatory, part of Jubilee Church in Cape Town. And I was working for a ministry called the Message Trust, and we were excited by what God was doing in our lives. And probably at that breakfast over our 16th wedding anniversary, we reflected on some of these things. And although it had been a difficult season, we were still anticipating good things for the future and Laura to make a full recovery. One of the things about Laura was that she'd had a number of illnesses, chronic asthmatic, a number of other illnesses. So she was always very resilient. She was a creative person, loved life, loved people, but also incredibly resilient. And so she was determined that her illness would not stop this holiday from happening. And My brother arrived from the UK with his family, 15th of August, and we travelled to go on holiday together with them. We actually drove down to George, and we were just determined if we just get to the holiday destination, she'll be able to rest, recuperate, enjoy the family time. And actually the next day, our first day of holiday, it was a beautiful winter's day in George, and I often say it was like a perfect day. I'd see now God's grace in that moment. We were in George, we went down to Victoria Bay, one of our favourite beaches, and although Laura wasn't 100%, she sat on the beach, we had a picnic, all the cousins were playing together, even in the water. We walked along the promenade there. That evening we went home, had a braai, and actually were in blissful ignorance about what was about to unfold over the next 48 hours. The next morning, we woke up. We thought we'd just hit repeat. We had breakfast together. My brother and I went to the shop, but when we came back to the shop, my sister-in-law met us. She had one of those concerned looks on her face, and she said, Laura's had some kind of episode, something's wrong, she's got chronic headaches, she's lying down in your bedroom. And I went in and immediately said, just call an ambulance. This is what happened 2 months ago. We just need to get her to hospital and she'll be fine. She was deteriorating and the ambulance wasn't coming, so we got her into the back of the car, took her to the hospital, and someone led me the way to the hospital. We took her straight into the emergency room. As she was driving in the car, Laura was an incredible woman of faith. She was crying out to Jesus and just saying, how long till we get to the hospital? And I was saying, we're nearly there. But we got her to the hospital and they took her into the emergency room once more. And at that point, as she lay down, she cried out one more time to the Lord, and then she passed out. And it was one of those moments where I guess I feared the worst, but still expected the best. They asked me to wait, and you know what hospitals are like, there are forms to fill in. I had to wait outside, but I could see that the hospital was on high alert. It felt like a scene, like I was watching a scene from one of those hospital dramas, but now you're sat in that scene, and now the doctor is coming to sit next to me and to tell me what's happening. And it was only really that was the first time I heard the words brain aneurysm. And he believed that at that stage Laura had what proved to be a fatal brain aneurysm. The only hope was if she stabilised enough to fly her to Cape Town, where maybe she'd be able to get some emergency care. But it became clear over the next less than 24 hours, the next 12 to 18 hours, that she wasn't going to recover, that her vital signs began to deteriorate. And so I had to face this situation. I now describe it and as facing the future. I didn't choose, it was immediate, it was so rapid, and I was having to process, and it was a very broken time, as you can imagine. That night, I had to go home and talk to the children about what had happened. The hospital encouraged me to get some rest. At 2 o'clock in the morning, they phoned me again and asked me to come back and said, your wife is now nearing the end, and with the doctors are going to request by the morning that we turn off the life support systems that we have. And I just now knew I only had a few hours to sit by the bedside of my wife. And during that night, obviously all kinds of thoughts were going through my head. How on earth can I find a way forward? How can I manage with 3 children? How can I even think of facing this uncertain future? And I prayed to God. My prayer was very simple and very childlike. And I said to God, everything I've believed since childhood had better be true. I need it to be true now more than ever. And if you like, that was my bargain with God. I just need it to be true. The morning came, the doctors came, they again explained the situation. And at that point we had to turn off the life support machine and say goodbye to Laura on planet Earth, knowing that because she loved Jesus, she was going to an eternity with him in heaven. And here was I, now a single dad, a widower with 3 children, trying to find a way forward. The grief was overwhelming and the future seemed very uncertain. Throughout that night, as I'd been in the hospital, word had spread through our networks and family that Laura was critically ill. And people were praying around the world, and they were praying for a miracle. They were praying for Laura to recover. And it was as I reflected on over the coming days, obviously there's all the questions why. Why did the miracle not happen? Why did God allow a 38-year-old mother of 3 to die in what many would consider the prime of her life? And in some ways, several years on, I can't say that those questions have been answered. We didn't get the major miracle. But actually, what I did sense, even quite early on, is that God was at work in many small miracles, in many minor details that were in their own way miraculous. A few that I reflect on was that part of my job was to travel quite a lot. And the very fact that I wasn't traveling, that I could be by Laura's side, and brain aneurysm can be triggered at any time. Where could I have been? But I was by her bedside. That was a gift of God's grace. And then, my brother doesn't come to South Africa often, but when the doctor said, is there someone you can call to come and be with you during this time? My brother was a few miles away and able to get straight in a car and spend that whole time with me when I needed someone who could share in that grief and pain with me. And there were other things, the nursing staff in the middle of the night were Christians and were praying for me, and it was completely unexpected. And then a beautiful moment when a Dutch Reformed pastor was called by the hospital, and he just came and sat with me. He almost said nothing, but when I looked up, he had tears in his eyes and he was weeping with me as I was weeping as well. These gifts of grace. Within a few days, we were staying at Carmel Guest Farm. They'd opened up more chalets for us, and our family gathered from around the world to come together. And although it was the sorrow and grief that brought us together, there was also a sense of God's presence as we came together, that He was with us. There was a gift of grace. In that sudden moment, it was deep grief, but I also began to sense God's grace. And that's why I share my story, really, is to help people in the grief of life begin to get the courage and hope that God can meet us when we need Him most, where He can be the grace, or bring us the grace that we need in life to face the future that we would never have chosen. C.S. Lewis, in his book, A Grief Observed, he said that grief is a process. And one of the reasons we're putting this series of videos together, of this film series together, is to help people who are in this process of grief. Because I think what I've realized again several years on is grief is not something you simply get over. It's something you continue to work through, to navigate. And through this series, we really want to help with some signposts from my own story and also the story of others that are going to share in this series. As we'll also mention, I've written about this in books, and you can get hold of Grief and Grace, Facing the Future I Didn't Choose, my book, which will also, I believe, help you in your journey and help you help others in their journey. I believe in God, and all the people sharing their testimonies as part of this series are believers, and this should help us have a different perspective on death, that there is hope beyond the grave. And so we really trust that this series will help you find hope and courage, not just in your own self, but actually in the grace of God. Paul in Corinthians, there's a verse that he writes. He says, "Death, oh, where is your sting?" And in some ways what he's writing about is that because of our faith, because of the grace of God, the sting of death is maybe not as painful as it might be. But I do want to acknowledge, actually, that grief does sting. that if you're watching this and you've been through grief or loss, it could be the loss or death of a loved one, it could be loss of income, it could be some other tragedy that you've come across, that there is a sting that you are feeling. There's a sting that I felt, and there was a deep grief and loss when Laura died, and we're not trying in any way to belittle the pain that we are facing. But what we do want to do is point us to a future hope, to say that there is a pathway of grace that you can walk along, and there is a way that you can face the future you didn't choose. We hope that you will join us on this journey in the coming weeks, and that you will benefit greatly from this video series.
Thanks, Tim, for sharing your story. As Tim mentioned, grief is not something to get over, but to continue journeying through. Perhaps you would like to purchase a copy of Tim's book, Grief and Grace, to read alongside watching the series. It is available on Kindle, currently at reduced price, and details are on the screen. Please join us next week for our next episode.